is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Hello and welcome to Global Business Europe, live from CGTN in London. I'm Jamie Owen.
And I'm Juliet Mann. Our top stories. G20 foreign ministers meet face-to-face, with hosts Italy calling for greater global cooperation to tackle the pandemic.
Our other headlines: Facebook is now the fifth US tech giant to be worth over $1 trillion, boosted by a victory in court.
UK car makers call for the government to move up a gear in support for electric vehicle production. And...
Come on, England! Come on! Yeah, of course, that Germany wins.
We're at Wembley for the latest on England v Germany as they battle for a place in the quarter-finals of Euro 2020. We need to work together, the message from the G20 meeting in Italy, where many leaders are meeting face-to-face for the first time since the pandemic.
But while everyone seemed to agree on global cooperation, some countries were accused of not doing enough to help end the pandemic. Our correspondent Tony Waterman joins us from Matera in Italy. Good to see you, Tony. Now, the pandemic and vaccine distribution, that's what's taken centre stage in the G20 meeting. What's been said?
Yeah, it certainly has. And of course, this pandemic is at the forefront of everybody's mind, at the forefront of political agendas at this point. And this health crisis has really highlighted how interconnected the world has become in the last 40 or 50 years and how vulnerable it is when there's a global disruption, especially on the trade front. In his opening remarks, the Italian Foreign Minister, Luigi Di Maio, who is hosting this event, said this is a global crisis that needs a global response, that these countries cannot take a nationalistic approach, which we had seen take place in the early days of this pandemic, that to build back together, no one is going to be left behind. Take a listen to what he had to say.
The COVID-19 pandemic has shown us the necessity of an international and coordinated response for emergencies that go beyond states. In an interconnected world, multilateralism and international cooperation are the only really efficient tools when faced with global challenges.
Unfortunately, this is not what is taking place in reality. We have seen that the pandemic has really exacerbated global inequalities. These poor, lower-income countries are going to really struggle to emerge stronger from this pandemic. We also have this enormous gap when it comes to vaccinations. Rich countries, developed countries have now vaccinated 50, 60, 70% of their population, while lower-income countries are still struggling to vaccinate the most vulnerable people in their population, these older individuals, these frontline workers. We also have seen some tension among some of the G20 members themselves when it comes to vaccinations. The German Foreign Minister, Heiko Maas, called out Russia and China earlier today, saying that they're using vaccine diplomacy for these short-term gains, but something that is not going to solve the long-term problem. The Chinese Foreign Minister, Wang Yi, who joined this G20 summit today via video conference, encouraged and urged the countries that have the space to make sure that they're not limiting vaccine exports, and that this is what's really going to close the vaccine gap that we're seeing right now. So that, of course, directed towards places like the EU, which have restrictions in place, also the United States, which has not been exporting a lot of vaccines. But many of these developed countries within the G20, they have talked a very good game when it comes to vaccine inequality, really from the get-go here. And they have pledged to donate tens of millions, sometimes hundreds of millions of vaccines. But that is really just a drop in the water when it comes to what is actually needed to ensure that the entire population is fully vaccinated.
So, Tony, this focus on multilateral cooperation to address the global pandemic, is it what we've heard before? What's new?
Yeah, there's a big focus from these ministers today on taking a multilateral approach, that this is the only way that this issue is going to actually be resolved. There is a change, of course, that has taken place because the U.S. has a new president in the White House, one that really believes in multilateralism. The Trump administration was an administration that didn't care about multilateralism or working with allies. So there has been a shift there from the world's largest economy. And, of course, the world's second largest economy, China, has become quite a defender of multilateralism. And my colleague from Beijing, Zhenze Yan, has this report.
Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi says the G20 should lead by example by safeguarding multilateralism. He made a comments when attending the G20 Foreign Ministers meeting online at the invitation of Italian Foreign Minister Luigi Di Maio. The gathering is taking place in Matera, Italy.
We should adhere to win-win cooperation and oppose zero-sum games. Multilateralism is not just a slogan, and it cannot become a package that promotes unilateralism.
Multilateralism was the key word repeated at Tuesday's meeting, as the foreign ministers call on all parties to cooperate on trade and commit to boost the recovery from the pandemic. China echoed the thoughts, saying the G20 should lead the way in the global economic recovery.
We need to ensure and stabilize the global production and supply chains and avoid the fragmentation of the international market, the politicization of cooperation mechanisms, and ideology in rules and standards. We need to promote structural reform and achieve a recovery of high quality and resilience.
The Foreign Affairs Ministers meeting is one of the ministerial meetings organized as part of the G20 Leaders Summit 2021. The main event will be hosted by Italy in Rome in October later this year. Foreign Minister Wang Yi says challenges still remain in fighting against the global pandemic. He says all countries should continue to deepen cooperation on vaccines, diagnosis, and prevention control, especially in supporting developing countries, and that China will work with other members to have a successful gathering in Rome.
There was actually a very interesting thing that the U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken brought up in his opening remarks of this meeting today. He talked about debt relief for some of these poorer and lower income countries. The G20 has committed to debt suspension. This is something they did in the early days of the pandemic, and they really focused on those low income countries, but they left out middle income countries, which are also at risk of these very, very high debt burdens. And the debt piles have been really piling up. The emerging markets hitting a record $86 trillion in debt in the first quarter of this year. So he's starting to float this idea. This is a decision that is not going to be made here at the G20 meeting of the affairs ministers and the development ministers. This is really paving the way for the finance ministers who are going to be meeting in Venice just next week. This is something that they're now going to be taking up, but sort of testing the waters here to see how other countries respond to this idea of debt relief for these poorer countries so that they can have more wiggle room with their finances when it comes to recovering from this pandemic.
Interesting stuff. Tony Waterman, thank you very much.
Kelly Gerardi is Italy's former Undersecretary for Economic Development. Good to have your company. The blurb on this G20 summit talks about people, planet, prosperity. These are the meeting's priorities for the G20. I suppose they could have thrown in the words motherhood and apple pie. It all sounds a bit ambitious, doesn't it?
It is, on one hand, these meetings need to be like that. They need to be ambitious to set the scene, and maybe then there will be follow-up by certain governments, maybe in bilateral ways, maybe by certain companies that take down, let's say, the advice of what comes out from the G20 communiques. I've attended many of those G20 meetings. They tend to be setting the stage for other people then to deliver. So I'm moderately positive that at least those words are in there. Let's see what comes out from the discussion, what practical things can be done, because we really don't have too much time for talking. We really need to act.
Now, you're a veteran of these international political gatherings, but for those of us who are not, there's a big change in the structure here. As I understand it, this is the first time diplomats and development officials are invited to the G20 meeting. What's the thinking behind that?
It's like try to make it a little bit more practical, so a little bit of expertise, so that it's not just a talk about foreign affairs, because foreign affairs is a tricky business. You need to be nice to everyone. You need to avoid the problem, while maybe development experts need to really tackle the problems. So it's just the nature of the diplomacy that shies away from highlighting diversity, or so it should be, and focuses on things that are in common, which is the good part of the equation. The second part is to find the problem that we need to solve, and that's left for the second group of people. So in a way, it is a nice idea. Foreign minister, smile and talk about nice things, cooperation, and the other people, the other group, try to solve the problems that are there. Otherwise, the meeting just becomes a meeting where the real issues are not addressed.
Multilateralism is what they keep on banging on about. That's the catchphrase at this meeting. But it really does need to be more than just a slogan, doesn't it? The reality seemingly is falling somewhat short.
Indeed, because we tend to think of multilateralism as an end-to-end countries, 200 countries deal and trade with the other 200 countries. At the end of the day, however, we are now unfortunately seeing a tendency to decoupling, a tendency to West and East highlighting differences rather than where they can cooperate. And this is, in a way, when we have crisis, I justify, but I don't like it, that everyone tries to do their own business. Countries try to reshore production of certain materials and goods that are deemed to be necessary. They don't want to rely on external supply. We have seen disruption in the value chain, and even industry that were thought not to be particularly sensitive, like clothing and face masks, are now becoming very sensitive, almost as sensitive as semiconductors. So people retrench, they get ready in case there is a storm to at least have stock ready to continue to do business as usual without to rely necessarily on other partners. And this is not good for the integration and for the multilateralism, because it leads into protectionism, it leads into even minimized exchanges, not just of goods, but even people to people, tourism, exchange in science, technology, university. I fear that after limiting the trade of goods, we also move on to limiting other issues, other exchanges. And that would be very, very bad.
Okay, Geraci in Rome. We've been beaten by the clock. I'm so sorry to interrupt you, but we have to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed for coming on the programme.
Thank you.
French President Emmanuel Macron has inaugurated Jpmorgan's new trading hub in Paris. Macron is actively trying to promote France as a destination for banks and high-tech companies. A number of London-based investment banks have relocated some staff to the European Union to retain access to the single market post-Brexit. Jpmorgan's new hub will employ 800 people in Paris by 2022.
The UK's housing market is growing at the fastest rate for 17 years as the pandemic pushes people to seek more space. The Nationwide Building Society says government tax breaks also boosted the sector. Average house prices rose 0.7% from May to June.
United Airlines has confirmed its biggest ever plane order as it bets on a post-pandemic travel bounce. The airline will spend more than $35 billion on 270 new Airbus and Boeing aircraft. The Chicago-based carrier has been more exposed to the slump in international travel than other US airlines, which are more focused on domestic flying. You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, a historic meeting between Israel and the UAE. Why it could be a turning point and good news for trade.
Search CGTN Europe wherever you get your podcasts to subscribe to The Agenda podcast. The Agenda with me, Stephen Cole, always gets to the heart of the story. Just subscribe today and listen now.
covering the world from 4 continents. A new horizon. Teams in Beijing, Washington, D.C., Nairobi, and London, who connect, interact, and inquire to bring you the stories that matter to all. The Link, only on CGTN. Facing the unknown is always difficult. In a world in turmoil, it's easy to lose orientation. But when the storms come, we have to see the possibilities, reinvent, find new opportunities, discover a path forward. CGTN. See the difference.
The world has changed under the pressure of the pandemic. For many of us, life is returning to some kind of normal. As we're adapting to changes in all of our lives, let Global Business Europe be your guide to the new normal. Join us weekdays on CGTN.
Hello, welcome back to Global Business Europe. Facebook is now part of an elite group of companies valued at over $1 trillion. The social media company's shares jumped in late-day trading after it won a significant antitrust victory against an American regulator.
Facebook's the 5th US company to hit this milestone, joining Microsoft, Apple, Amazon and Google parent company Alphabet. CGTN's correspondent John Terrett is in New York. John, I know you often have acronyms for this, like FANG. This is not FANG. Have you got one for this group of trillionaires?
Jealous, lucky. Wish I had their kind of money. That's all I can say. It's funny, you know. It's funny you should mention that, because I was at the stock exchange yesterday. I was here, not in our studio overlooking the floor, but I actually went to the balcony that we use at 5 o'clock local time in the afternoon. I was standing there and I could see Facebook shares going up and up and up in the last hour. And I didn't know why. And it turns out, of course, once I left the exchange, I realized that this judge had handed down this judgment on Facebook. And, you know, it's a remarkable thing, really. There were 2 lawsuits against Mark Zuckerberg's company. I think they came to light first. I think I remember talking to you, Juliet, about them back in December of last year. One was by the Federal Trade Commission. And then the other one was by 46 state attorneys general around the country. So almost all the attorneys general in the United States, bar about 4 of them, plus 2 others, the District of D.C. and Guam, which is an American territory. And these things are always very, very complex and difficult to read into, and certainly difficult to get into a 2-minute television interview. But think of it like this. Basically, both of these suits against Facebook allege that the company had taken part in a sort of systematic strategy in order to crush their competition. And basically, it means that they were buying up rivals. And of course, as we know, Facebook owns WhatsApp and also Instagram, or Insta, as we trendy people here in New York like to refer to it. And the suits actually called for the sale of those 2 divisions and other divisions at Facebook as well, so that they would either become standalone companies or that they would be taken over by other corporations, but that Facebook would be relieved of the duty of looking after them. So Facebook shares yesterday were up almost 5% in that final hour of trading. It was not quite 5%, but almost. And, of course, it is now a $1 trillion company. And as I think you said at the top, Juliet, it joins 4 others. We've got Apple at $2.2 trillion, Microsoft at exactly $2 trillion, Amazon at $1.7, Alphabet at $1.6, and now Facebook at just a little bit over $1 trillion. The share price is down now, so it may be a bit below $1 trillion, but it doesn't matter. It made it there yesterday.
And it was a knee-jerk reaction and a big boost for big tech. What was the judge's ruling?
Well, this was a federal judge. It's a U.S. district judge called James Boasberg, and he basically threw out all the work put together by both suits, describing both of them as legally insufficient. In other words, the evidence was too weak. Simple as that. So they've gone, but they do have 30 days in which to redraft everything and present it to the judge again. So this story has certainly not gone away as far as Facebook is concerned, although Facebook says, obviously, it's very happy to see the result of this decision by the judge so far, and it always strives to give the very best product at all time. Now, I don't think that this challenging of these big global corporations that, you know, are just all over the place and used by everybody and straddle borders. The challenging of them, I think, is not going to go away. Here in America, I would say the Republicans are concerned, particularly about companies like Facebook and Instagram and WhatsApp, the bias that they might induce. And the Democrats are concerned about the size and the lack of tax that is apparently being paid in various jurisdictions, that sort of thing. The Biden administration is going to try again. He has been rejigging members of his team in the Federal Trade Commission and elsewhere. I think, though, that the court cases keep failing, don't they? They just keep falling short. And I think the reason for that is very, very difficult to prove antitrust allegations for all sorts of reasons. And I think it might, in the end, come down to moves in the Congress. I think if they really want to go after these companies and break them up or hobble them in any way, then the only way to do that is to pass laws in the Congress in Washington, D.C., and that would mean changes to the U.S. antitrust laws as they stand at the moment. And as you know, finally, these companies, including Facebook and Google and Microsoft, they're all under attack all the time in the European Union. In Germany, we did this story only last week. Here, when that happens overseas, people pay very little attention with the greatest of respect. They just say, well, whatever they decide, we'll pay the fine and move on. But here, potentially, this is more serious for them.
Potentially more serious. Well, 30 days to appeal, and 30 days is a long time on the markets. John Terrett, thank you.
Europe needs to become more innovative and independent. That was the challenge from the German Chancellor Angela Merkel at the Brussels Economic Forum as EU leaders set out a vision of the post-pandemic future. Our correspondent Lucy Hoff is in Brussels for us. Lucy, so what exactly was Angela Merkel's message?
Angela Merkel's message was one of assertiveness and independence from Europe when it comes to technologies and digital industries, in a message I think that can be interpreted as one directed at the dominance of China. She said that this was not about becoming a competitor or limiting cooperation with partners such as Beijing, but rather becoming a more dynamic business partner when it comes to modernizing Europe's infrastructure and digital capabilities, anything from artificial intelligence, big data, or micro technologies. So a really important message, and one that comes towards the end of her, of course, long 16-year tenureship as German Chancellor. One of the last times that she will address an audience here in Brussels. Here is Angela Merkel speaking in Brussels to the Economic Forum earlier.
Europe needs to become more independent, needs to be able to determine its own fate and act accordingly. So let us take, for example, digital sovereignty. Becoming sovereign in the digital world doesn't mean to limit our cooperation with our partners. Rather, the contrary is true.
The President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, offered an upbeat vision of the EU's future, didn't she?
She did, yes, and there's two tracks to this, one of which is the vaccine rollout in Europe, which, as she said, was very much hitting its stride at this stage. The other is that landmark recovery fund that was signed off last summer of some 800 billion euros in funds that will start to be mobilised from July, the European Commission having issued bonds in the last couple of weeks. She really said that this was a historic fund that was going to really turbocharge Europe's recovery from the pandemic. She said that Europe's economy was on track to grow by 4.2% this year and 4.4% next year, far exceeding expectations at the end of last year. So here's Ursula von der Leyen again addressing the Brussels Economic Forum.
With Next Generation EU, we are doing more than just increase our GDP. We are building a new economy, digital, circular, and sustainable. So this is just the beginning. We have a long, exciting road ahead of us. Next Generation EU is the recovery Europe needs now and for the future. So let's make it a success. Let's do that together.
So Ursula von der Leyen there very much saying that Europe's recovery is down to this vaccine rollout as well, with 60% of European adults now being given their first dose, just over 40% fully vaccinated. But she said more needed to be done to ensure that there were high levels of immunity in European neighbours and that Europe should step up in ensuring vaccine supplies for the developing world.
Lucy Hoff in Brussels, thank you very much. Build Back Better. It's an inspiring slogan to frame how many leaders and businesses say they want to recover from the pandemic. Now the British car industry is setting out its roadmap for the future.
A new report calls for bold action from the government to help the sector meet ambitious carbon reduction targets and not be left behind in the race to an electric future. CGTN's Paul Barber reports.
It will be here before we know it. 2030 is the year the British government has committed to banning the sale of new petrol and diesel vehicles by. But is the auto industry on track for net zero? A report by the Society of Motoring Manufacturers and Traders, or the SMMT, is calling for what it calls a Build Back Better fund. The core of it is battery production and a binding target of 60 gigawatt-hours capacity to be built by the end of the decade, giving British car makers the ability to produce up to 1 million e-vehicles every year. But that is a daunting task. Nissan is expected to announce a major investment in a new gigafactory at its Sunderland plant, creating thousands of new jobs. It currently makes the Nissan Leaf there the only major battery manufacturer in the country, with an output of around just 2 gigawatt-hours. The new capacity would be at least 6.5 gigawatt-hours. Meanwhile, the auto giant Stellantis is still considering whether its plants over in Ellesmere Port has a future at all building electric cars. The SMMT is also calling for at least 2.3 million new charging points around the country by 2030. They say this will give all drivers the confidence to invest in green cars. The government says there are now nearly 24,000 public charging points, which critics say is well behind schedule. The stakes are high, with these changes presenting an opportunity to transform the sector and create 40,000 well-paid jobs. The industry currently employs 180,000 people directly and contributes more than $20 billion to the economy. Well, for more on this, I'm joined by the Chief Executive of the SMMT, Mike Hawes. My first question is, why can't the UK afford to stand still on these innovations? What are the risks involved in standing still?
No country, no market, no industry can afford to stand still. The pace of technological change is accelerating, and for the automotive industry, it feels like it's coming from 100 different ways. The move towards electrification, increasing connectivity, increasing autonomy, changing approach to mobility. If you stand still, you're missing opportunities.
2024 is when the level of UK-made components in British-made cars needs to increase in line with the terms of the trade deal with the European Union. Can battery capacity really be ramped up to the levels necessary to keep British car making competitive?
It is soon, and first of all, the government, in negotiating the TCA, the agreement between the UK and Europe, was very clear. Wanted to try and ensure that the UK automotive industry had a fair wind behind it to be able to meet some of these challenges. So we think that deal is one we can work with. It was a relief to get it because we desperately needed a deal, but it does get ever tougher in successive years. The first milestone's 2024, then 2027. Now, increasingly, the value of a vehicle moves over these next few years away from the engine, the diesel and petrol engine, into more of the software and especially into more of the battery. For the first stage, 2024, it's probably manageable. By 2027, if you want zero tariff trade between the UK and Europe in automotive terms, the battery has to be made either in Europe and the UK. We want to make sure batteries are made here because that helps secure manufacturing here of vehicles for the long term.
With the pandemic, with Brexit, and now the global computer chip shortage, how on earth can the UK overcome these challenges and consign the internal combustion engine to history?
It's not so much of how, it's got to. You're right in talking about some of the challenges we face. Most obviously, shortage of semiconductors. That's a global issue. It's affecting everyone, and in the automotive industry. You know, we've got a date. By 2030, the UK will end the sale of petrol and diesel engines. So the market will shift, leading up to and from that point forward. The bigger challenge is to make sure that we still have a large market and a successful market, and also that a significant proportion of the vehicles that are fulfilling that market are made here. That is the challenge for the industry. And it's, whether we like it or not, this is the direction of travel that not just the UK government is going in, European governments, international governments are coming in. We're hosting COP26 here in the UK at the end of the year. We expect a lot of global initiatives to address climate change, and road transport, as the biggest emitter in many countries, including the UK, has to play its part. Hence, we have to make this transition.
And that was the Society of Motor Manufacturers and Traders, Mike Hawes, speaking to Paul Barber.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead as temperature records are broken across the United States and Canada. We're live from Washington State.
The EU's digital COVID certificate, which offers the promise of unlocking hassle-free travel around Europe this summer.
In less than 2 weeks' time, the Czech border will also open to all EU and Serbian citizens. 4.4 million Hungarians received their first dose of COVID vaccine.
18 and over can receive a COVID-19 vaccination, but it does come with conditions.
Third wave will probably take longer to emerge. This vaccination centre is part of a massive effort to try and drive down the numbers of the new variant that was first identified in India.
On the agenda with me, Stephen Cole, we look up into space. We look down into data. We look at debt. We look at politics. We look at opioids, climate change. We look at all the issues that really matter around the world. But you matter too. We want to tell the stories you want to see and hear about. Make it your agenda.
We can try out the wild and crazy ideas.
Nothing can stop an idea whose time is coming. This idea is coming.
I actually feel quite comfortable in isolation.
We should all be very basic when we're trying to save the world.
Oh, no.
We hope it will happen. We have to live in hope.
The agreement is signed. But what is the real deal now the UK has left the EU? For trade, for business, for the city, for ordinary people. Make sense of Brexit with CGTN.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe with Jamie Owen and me, Juliet Mann. Our top stories. G20 foreign ministers meet face-to-face with hosts Italy calling for greater global cooperation to tackle the pandemic.
One of the headlines, Facebook is now the 5th US tech giant to be worth over $1 trillion, boosted by a victory in court.
And more than 40,000 fans gather at Wembley Stadium for a crucial England match against Germany in Euro 2020. It's a big celebration to mark 100 years. The Communist Party of China is marking its centenary by honouring its outstanding members.
Xi Jinping, General Secretary of the CPC's Central Committee, handed out the July the 1st medals in Beijing. CGTN's Zhao Yunfei reports.
Honor Guards present the July 1st Medal, the party's highest honor. Featuring the CPC emblem and a 5-pointed star, the medals are awarded to party members who have made exceptional contributions to the party and country. Xi Jinping, General Secretary of CPC Central Committee, presents the award. Among the honorees are those who've contributed to China's revolution, reform and opening up, poverty eradication, and the building of a modernly prosperous society in all aspects. One of them spoke on behalf of the group to thank the party.
I take the party's reputation very seriously and the title of CPC member very seriously. What we have done are the things that are still being done by lots of CPC members. The party's centenary is coming soon. I sincerely wish for the party to remain young forever, the prosperity and strength of the great motherland, and the happiness and well-being of its people.
The CPC Central Committee says the honorees have created spiritual treasures for the party. Among the 29 medal recipients, 4 are over the age of 100. 3 are honored posthumously. General Secretary Xi urged all party members to learn from these everyday heroes.
July 1st medal recipients are heroes coming from and deeply rooted in the people. They are ordinary heroes who are dedicated to their work without a complaint. Their deeds and spirits can be learned by others. They prove through concrete actions that every party member can make great contributions to national rejuvenation for the party and the people, with firm faith, strong will of striving and resilience, and taking actions at usual, critical and difficult times.
Besides awarding the July 1st medal, the CPC is also recognizing 349 outstanding members, 262 workers, and 309 grassroots organizations. This is the first time the Communist Party of China has awarded the July 1st medal, as it celebrates 100 years since it was founded. More will be handed out in the future on major anniversaries. Zhao Yunfei, CGTN, at the Great Hall of the People, Beijing.
Italy's former Prime Minister has fond memories of China's past and strong views about its future. Massimo D'Alema says it's critical the lines of communication between China and the West remain open.
In an interview with CGTN, he described his first visit to Beijing many years ago.
I remember we were guests at the Beijing Hotel, which at that time was maybe the biggest building in the city. I remember in the morning the rustling of thousands and thousands of bicycles. They passed through Tiananmen Square. Every now and then a car passed by. It was a great experience. That was my first contact with the reality of China. Since then, I had many opportunities to visit China too, and to follow the great transformation of the country. Without any doubt, in the past years, there has been a significant capacity to develop relations, political ones too. Now there's been a slowing down of that, partly due to the pandemic, partly due to a more difficult international context. But it's very important. I believe it's very important we develop all sorts of dialogue and collaboration between not only parties, but also societies, organisations, cultural groups, intellectuals, different characters, and so on. It would be very negative if we had to go back to being reciprocally closed off. We need to go on with our dialogue, with meeting each other.
Temperature records are being smashed across the US Northwest and Canada, with officials now warning of serious health, ecological and infrastructure consequences.
Portland, Seattle and Vancouver have all seen the heat rise beyond anything seen before, with the city of Portland touching nearly 47 degrees. Well, Mark New is right in the middle of the heat wave. Good to see you, Mark. Now, these temperatures are truly astonishing. Is there any let-up in the heat today?
That's right, Juliet. Forgive me, I'm looking a bit sweaty here. I think the last time we spoke, I was in sub-zero temperatures in Alaska, so my body is definitely having to acclimate here. I'm here in Spokane, Washington, which is about 4 hours drive east of Seattle in the Pacific Northwest, along the Washington State-Idaho border. It is now 9:30 a.m. and it's about 93 degrees Fahrenheit. That translates to 34 degrees Celsius. It's expected to hit 112, which would be about 43 degrees Celsius where I am, and that would be an all-time record for this time of the year. Now, I spoke to the Spokane branch of the National Weather Service, and a forecaster there tells me that in years past, the average temperature was about 80 degrees Fahrenheit or 26 degrees Celsius, so it's about 18 degrees above the average here right now. This heat wave hit several weeks ago in Northern California and in San Francisco, where I'm typically based, and that's now risen to the Pacific Northwest, hitting areas including Seattle, Portland, and western parts of Canada, which are all hitting record temperatures. Now, what's causing this heat wave? It's called a heat dome. Essentially, that's an area of high pressure that hovers over a particular region. Think of a pot and a lid over it, and the heat just being trapped inside. Scientists have shown that heat domes are more likely during La Nina years, and this is a La Nina weather pattern year, where waters are cool in the eastern Pacific and warm in the western Pacific. That temperature difference creates these winds that blow tropical western air eastward, and that warm air gets trapped in a jet stream and delivered to the west coast. That produces abnormal temperatures that last for consecutive days and nights, scorching temperatures that we're seeing now. Juliet.
Well, Mark, we've been looking at pictures of people frolicking in water, enjoying the weather, but there have been warnings about the impact of this heat, and not just on people.
That's right. It is very worrisome, especially for the elderly. Warnings of heat stroke, and people are, they've set up cooling centers around the city to make sure people can find shelter. In particular, a lot of areas in the Pacific Northwest don't have air conditioning because they simply are not used to these temperatures. People have been encouraged to go to the malls, theaters, wherever they can get air conditioning. And also outside the home, infrastructure is certainly being tested. We've seen a lot of images of streets cracking on the local TV news. Even this past weekend in Portland, they had to suspend a streetcar service because the power line cables melted. And this is all putting a strain on the power grid, as well as there have been at least a dozen power shortages in the Pacific Northwest. And in Canada, at least 15 school districts had to cancel classes because they simply did not have the facilities to keep the children cool. So essentially, this Pacific Northwest area is just not designed, their infrastructure, their buildings, not designed to deal with this kind of heat, making it all the more difficult. Julia.
Well, Mark, I hope you can get some shelter, get some shade and a nice cool drink. Thanks very much. Mark New.
Let's stay in the United States because the search for survivors of a Miami building collapse has entered its 6th day. The last person pulled alive from the rubble was 4 days ago, and emergency services say they're preparing to enter a recovery phase. 2 bodies were found on Monday, taking the official death toll to 11 people. 150 people are still missing after the building collapse as residents slept.
Former South African President Jacob Zuma has been sentenced to 15 months in prison for contempt of court. Zuma was sentenced after he failed to appear at a corruption inquiry earlier this year. The inquiry is looking into allegations of corruption during Zuma's term in office from 2009 and 2018. Zuma has denied any wrongdoing and has not cooperated with the inquiry.
Rebel forces in Ethiopia's northern Tigray region have retaken its capital, Mekelle. At the same time, the central government has called a humanitarian ceasefire in the region. The fighting in Ethiopia's northern region has killed thousands of people, displaced 2 million, with 1 million people on the brink of famine.
A former US Special Forces soldier and his son have told a court in Tokyo they regret helping the former boss of the Nissan car company flee Japan. Prosecutors claim they hid the former chief executive in a box and flew him to Lebanon for a fee of $1.3 million. They face 3 years in jail if found guilty.
China has revealed the world's first result from an efficacy test for a COVID vaccine among children and teenagers. The report, published in the medical magazine The Lancet, found Sinovac jabs can trigger a strong immune reaction among people aged 3 to 17. The manufacturer said these findings would boost public confidence in vaccinations for young people. Israel's foreign minister has begun the first ever official visit by an Israeli minister to the United Arab Emirates.
The two-day trip, which Yair Lapid has called historic, comes after the two countries normalised diplomatic ties last year. Jacob Greaves reports from Dubai.
Well, some of the biggest symbolic gestures will come with the opening of the Israeli embassy in Abu Dhabi today and the consulate's office in Dubai tomorrow. Both buildings further cementing those ties normalised last year. His schedule is also set to include a meeting with his foreign minister counterpart, where we can expect security to be high on the agenda. The UAE has seen this normalisation as a means to boost its security standing in the region. Shortly after the agreement was signed last year, the then Trump presidency sanctioned the sale of advanced F-35 fighter jets to the region. Israel, meanwhile, has been keen to tout the deal as a way to boost economic integration in both the UAE but also the broader region. There is expected to be an economic cooperation agreement signed during this trip, and Lapid is also set to visit Expo 2020, the site of a world fair in Dubai, expected to open in October, where Israel will have a pavilion, a place to promote its business, exports and technology. Trade between the two has undoubtedly rapidly grown, with deals even being struck in slightly more controversial areas, such as with Israeli defence firms. But equally, some of the more fanfare we've seen from the UAE government when this was initially announced has subsided compared to when the normalisation deal was struck. International media, for example, aren't being given access to the joint Israeli-UAE engagements taking place during this trip, with access overall being tightly controlled. Since the flare-up in Israeli-Palestinian tensions, the ties have been a focal point in a country with a large expatriate Arab population. This is in fact the first official engagement between the two countries since May's Israel-Gaza conflict. Abu Dhabi, for example, initially defended the deal last year as a means to pressure Israel to cease further settlement expansion. That said, the fact this trip is still taking place is a sign that ties can weather Israeli-Palestinian clashes. Further economic deals are expected, with Abu Dhabi's sovereign wealth fund eyeing a stake in an Israeli gas field that, if it goes through, could be the biggest deal between the two countries to date.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, a century of the city, how Shanghai became the bustling community it is today.
Each day, there are millions of stories. Each one can open new perspectives, new possibilities. Wherever you look, we are there. To see, discover, explore. We put the pieces together to find what really matters to you. All around the world, all around the clock. Our reporters are at home across the globe. From our headquarters in Beijing and production centers in Washington, Nairobi, and London, China Global Television Network. Stories from across the globe, reaching people across the globe. CGTN. See the difference.
Mari, what would you say is a good question?
Stephen, I'd say it's one where there's always more than one answer.
The Answers Project is a new podcast series from CGTN Europe. With me, Stephen Cole.
And me, Mari Beveridge. In each episode, we'll take a complex question.
And with the help of some of the world's foremost experts, shine light on some of the answers. So join us for The Answers Project.
Available wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe. Back to our coverage of China's big celebrations, the centenary of the Communist Party.
Shanghai today is a bustling city and one of the world's great financial centres. But its path to success hasn't always run smoothly. Li Juanhua reports.
This is the old part of Shanghai, a city nicknamed China's modern metropolis, after China was reduced to being a semi-colonial country well over a century ago. Numerous concessions were built around this area. The city used to be fraught with factional conflicts driven by multiple competing interests until it was liberated at the end of the 1940s. When the People's Liberation Army arrived in Shanghai in 1949, soldiers were requested to act according to strict instructions. Chief among them, soldiers were not allowed to enter residents' households or fire guns without a valid reason, and they all slept here in the street to make sure that they wouldn't disturb local residents' lives. Today, the war is remembered through historical archives, including handbooks instructing the soldiers of what to do when entering the city, and the diaries of those involved in the fighting. Ran Wuchang was in his 20s when his troops entered Shanghai, and he remembers it like yesterday.
In 3 days and 4 nights, we had 6 fights, from the first battle on Yinming Bridge to the last clashes with the KMT troops at Jiangwan Airport. After the last fight on May 27, 1949, we were ordered to leave the city immediately and head to the suburbs, part of our instructions to liberate Shanghai. The idea was to not disturb the locals.
Many didn't live to see today's Shanghai, a vibrant city with a skyline dominated by these fancy buildings. A younger generation of Chinese have taken over, stepping up the role of building the city their way. The company where Cao works helped dredge the Huangpu River, contributing to the city's modernization.
Since reform and opening up, especially in the 1990s, Shanghai's economy has started to take off. Frankly, now we get to enjoy imported food that we didn't have access to before, such as chocolate and milk powder. There was nothing in Pudong before other than farms. Now it's full of tall buildings and transport is convenient. As an old saying goes, I'd rather have a bed on the west of the Huangpu River than a house on the other side. Now it's quite the opposite.
Unlike his peers, Cao thinks the next step for Shanghai is rural vitalization, which he says should parallel urban development. He brought me to a village around Shanghai, which he has been developing for the past 3 years to help improve villagers' living standards.
Cities will be saturated sooner or later. The urban population is growing too fast. Part of the urban functions can be moved to the countryside. Many companies don't have to stay in cities. They can move to the countryside where the rent is lower and the environment is better. Moreover, they can benefit local villagers.
Cao says he believes rural development can help sustain development in Shanghai, taking it up a notch to the next level through its surrounding areas. Li Jianhua, CGTN, Shanghai.
Now, a very big football match is underway, not far from the studio. England are playing Germany in the knockout stage of Euro 2020.
It's a clash that carries all sorts of memories and emotions for supporters of both teams. 40,000 fans are at Wembley Stadium, and our correspondent Guy Henderson is there for us. Guy, it's half-time. Who's winning? How's the atmosphere?
Well, let's start with the atmosphere, Jamie. You said 40,000 fans. The vast majority, almost all of them, except I'm told for just under 2,000 German fans, are English, and you've really heard them on display here. It's a real, an electric atmosphere, double the numbers from the group stages, which also took place at Wembley Stadium. In terms of the match itself, we're at half-time at the moment. Gareth Southgate, the England manager, had said just before the match that he didn't want to see his side try and run on passion to try and win this game. He wanted to see composure, and I think we saw that from both sides. Quite a cagey start from both of them. Decent chances from set pieces at either side. Raheem Sterling and Timo Werner forcing decent saves at either end of the pitch as well in the first half. Germany arguably starting better, settling into the game better despite that massive England call and England cry. But England are warming up here, plenty of chances, but 0-0 at half-time.
Is this game anything as good as what we saw yesterday on what's been called Magic Monday?
Well, I think it's going to be very hard to beat those games, Jamie. I mean, you know, France to be knocked out by Switzerland, I don't think anyone saw that coming. There's really been, you know, some dramatic moments, penalty shootouts, and of course that is something that these two sides have a long and quite traumatic history in terms of, for England fans at least. Very hard to say at this stage whether it's going to be able to better that.
40,000 fans at Wembley, you say, Guy. That's going to increase, I think, to 60,000 fans for the semi-finals and the final of this tournament in 2 weeks' time. But more calls today for UEFA to consider moving these games out of the UK.
Yeah, so whoever wins this match will then play the quarter-final in Rome. England fans won't be able to travel from here to that. They would have to self-isolate. But the plan had always been that both the semi-final, one of the semi-finals and the final would then be played back here at Wembley Stadium. Now, this had caused a lot of discussion and debate. UEFA wanted crowds to fill the stadiums and said if that doesn't happen, well, then maybe we'll move the latter stages of the competition elsewhere. An agreement appeared to have been reached where the British government said, OK, we will up the number of people allowed into the stadium. But as you say, this is still a live debate because, you know, even throughout the day, we've heard both from the European Commission Vice President and the German Home Affairs Minister both saying that they are critical of that move to fill the stadiums as full as the organisers here at Wembley are planning to do so. One of those officials even calling it irresponsible. Now, UEFA has said it's happy with this offer and, you know, that it would like to see this semi-final and final going ahead. But clearly still some unease from leaders inside the European Union about the plans to fill the stadium here at Wembley as much as is currently the plan.
Guy, enjoy the game. Good to see you. Guy Henderson there at Wembley Stadium.
And finally, stolen art. Greek police have recovered a painting by Picasso, stolen almost a decade ago from the National Gallery in Athens. Picasso's Head of a Woman, along with another painting by Dutch painter Mondrian, were stolen.
Well, the police have arrested a Greek construction worker who hid the paintings outside Athens. Picasso had personally donated the painting to Greece in 1949 to honour the country's resistance to the Nazis. Greek authorities said the painting would have been impossible to sell on the open market because it had a personal inscription by Picasso on the back of the canvas.
The headlines again for you. G20 foreign ministers meet face-to-face with hosts Italy, calling for greater global cooperation to tackle the pandemic.
Our other headlines. Facebook is now the 5th US tech giant to be worth over $1 trillion, boosted by a victory in court.
Well, that's it for Global Business Europe. Thanks for watching. There's more on all of our stories at europe.cgtn.com, and do follow CGTN Europe on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram.
We're on smart TV apps such as Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire and Android TV, YouTube and Dailymotion, CGTN.com and the CGTN app. Coming up next on CGTN, it's Africa Live. We'll see you again tomorrow, same time, same place. From all of the team in London, it's goodbye.
Goodbye.